Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel on inclusionary zoning, understanding its potential to address Toronto's housing crisis. We have an expert panel assembled today. My name is Alan Walks. I'm a faculty member in geography and planning at the University of Toronto, and I'm also the co-lead of the Affordable Housing Challenge project with Dr. Sue Bunce, who's at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And we are with a number of our research assistants leading this project, which is through the school cities attempting to come up with some debate and analysis of the housing crisis that we currently are experiencing, and also to hopefully come up with some solutions to the housing crisis here in Toronto. And so that's kind of our mandate. We have been looking at a number of issues in the city of Toronto over I guess it's the last 2 years now. And that includes things like the rise of evictions, gentrification, financialization of the housing market, community land trusts. And now today we'll be talking about inclusionary zoning, which is often touted as a potential solution to solving the housing crisis. We have an expert panel of 4 people, but before I introduce them, I wanted to acknowledge the land that the university is existing on, and indeed that most of us are also, even though we're at home or in some other location outside of the university because of the lockdown, and we're participating online for this panel. Many of us are also occupying land that at one time was occupied by Indigenous peoples. And so we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and many of us operate. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'll also say, our topic today is inclusionary zoning. When we think about housing and we think about the acknowledgement that I just provided, and then we think about inclusionary zoning, it raises a whole host of questions. Of course, zoning is a way of designating land and specifying its use. Zoning explains or designates what is allowable on the land and what is not allowable. And in turn, it specifies who is allowable on land and who is not. In many ways, zoning could be considered a legacy of colonial era. And then we think of inclusionary zoning. And of course, when we think of inclusionary zoning, it's all about how do we include people that were otherwise excluded. And so thinking, kind of stepping back from the concept, this raises a whole bunch of questions. And it also, to me anyway, raises questions about the extent to which we might want to rely on some of the colonial institutions to provide for that kind of inclusion, and the extent to which we might want to open our minds to some alternatives that did not arise during colonial times, and that might be able to provide for some real forms of inclusion, democratic inclusion on the land that we occupy here in the Toronto region. So with saying that, we have an expert panel. What I think I'll do is I'll just briefly mention the panel, and then for each time that we have a panelist presenting, I'll provide the bio. So we have Christine Ono, Steve Pomeroy, Alejandra Ruiz-Vargas, and Jeremy Withers presenting today. And we're going to begin with Christine Ono. Christine Ono is a senior planner in the City of Toronto's Strategic Initiatives Policy and Analysis section. In her current role, she's the engagement lead for the development of Toronto's inclusionary zoning policy. Through development review, she also implements housing policies to secure affordable housing and maintain the city's existing supply of affordable rental housing. Prior to joining the city, Christine spent 7 years in the Ontario Municipal Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, developing provincial planning guidelines and legislation, including Ontario's legislative framework for inclusionary zoning. And in the kind of run up to this, to the introduction here, we heard that Christine is basically now implementing at the municipal level some of the policies that she designed at the provincial level. And so that's really wonderful to hear. So let's begin with Christine, and you can take the floor and with your presentation.
Thanks, Alan, and hi everyone. Happy to be here to chat about Toronto's work on inclusionary zoning to date. I'll just share my screen. We'll get started. So I guess to start, what is inclusionary zoning, or IZ? For those who are new to this term, it's really a land use planning tool that allows the city to require a certain percentage of affordable housing in new developments. So it's about making our city a more equitable and inclusive place. And it's also about ensuring affordable housing comes hand in hand with investments we're making in building transit, supporting community infrastructure, and modernizing our planning framework. So as Toronto continues to experience rapid growth and strong development activity, inclusionary zoning will really represent a shift in how we treat new developments in our city. With inclusionary zoning, the requirement for affordable housing is set out upfront in the city's official plan policy, instead of being negotiated on a site-by-site basis. And IZ requirements would be mandatory, meaning that affordable housing must be secured as part of the development approval process. So who does inclusionary zoning help? I like to explain it as a tool for those who earn too much to be eligible for social housing, but not enough to be able to afford market rents or prices. So if you lined up all of the households in the city from the lowest income earners to the highest income earners, IZ would really impact or influence that middle third of incomes. So based on this, we know inclusionary zoning on its own is not going to address all of Toronto's housing affordability challenges, but it's one tool among a range of actions that the city is pursuing as part of our Housing TO Action Plan to address housing affordability across that full spectrum, from homelessness to supportive housing, all the way up to market home ownership. So with that being said, the city is looking at all tools and levers available to help us work towards our goal of creating 40,000 new affordable rental homes over the next 10 years. The city is investing $8.5 billion between now and 2030 to help us achieve those goals. And this includes prioritizing supportive housing through our Modular supportive housing initiative, including affordable housing on city-owned lands through our Housing Now initiative, and prioritizing resources or incentives for building affordable rental housing through our Open Door affordable housing program. So as I talk about inclusionary zoning, I guess know that it's one tool among a range of actions that the city is pursuing to address housing affordability challenges in the city. With that being said, inclusionary zoning is a tool that Toronto has been looking to use for the past decade, and I'm sure Alejandra will say she's been working on that for even longer. But Ontario municipalities have only had the legal authority to implement inclusionary zoning since 2018. So the province sets out the process that municipalities have to undertake to implement the policies and some restrictions around how we can use it. To start, we have to develop what's called an assessment report. So this includes an analysis of housing need and demand in the city and an analysis of the financial impacts of potential inclusionary zoning policy. Next, the province requires us to outline certain things in our official plan and zoning bylaw. And one key provincial restriction is that inclusionary zoning can only be implemented in these areas called Protected Major Transit Station Areas, or PMTSAs. So these are areas generally within 500 to 800 meters of a transit station, where the city has undertaken an additional level of planning work that's approved by the province, which includes delineating the boundaries of those areas, identifying permitted uses of land, and minimum densities. So really the key message is that inclusionary zoning is limited to only being implemented around transit stations. Once we have an inclusionary zoning policy in place, The province requires us to report on IZ production every 2 years and to review that assessment report. So go back to the beginning every 5 years. Here's a quick snapshot of where we've been and where we're headed with our inclusionary zoning policy. To start, we initially developed a draft assessment report in 2019 and consulted on proposed policy directions over the summer of that year. And then last year, we updated the assessment report and released a draft official plan amendment policies and zoning bylaw amendment for consultation. So we've undertaken 2 rounds of consultation to date. Now we're working towards finalizing that assessment report and developing a final recommended policy, which will go to City Council for approval. And that final policy will be supported by inclusionary zoning implementation guidelines to help provide guidance around how the policy will be implemented. And then related to this work, the city is continuing critical work on identifying and delineating protected major transit station areas so that we're actually able to implement the policy. So the city has set out these 3 goals for our inclusionary zoning policy. The first is quite obvious. We hope to increase the supply of affordable housing. Secondly, we're looking to create more inclusive, complete, and equitable communities. And thirdly, we want to continue to encourage market housing by supporting a diverse range of housing supply. Inclusionary zoning is really a tool that depends on market developments to deliver affordable housing. And the policy itself will only be successful if market development continues to take place. And so it's really it's about finding that right balance between these 3 goals. So when we're trying to find that balance, I would say there's 4 main policy levers or dials that you can balance that all impact project viability. The first is the number or percent of affordable units required in a development. The second is the depth of affordability, so the household incomes that you're targeting for your policy. Third is the length of time the new affordable units have to stay affordable for. And finally, incentives or supports to help offset that cost of providing affordable units. So many jurisdictions undertake what's called a financial feasibility analysis to help them find that right balance between the policy requirements while continuing to support development viability. Toronto has undertaken its own financial impact analysis with the purpose of looking at the impacts of an IZ policy on the Toronto housing market and on the financial viability of development. So that intent goes back to our goal, that 3rd goal of ensuring market supply continues to take place. So we had our consultants undertake what's called a residual land value analysis, looking at the impacts of the policy on land values in the city. So there's some debate about how inclusionary zoning impacts development viability. Some say land prices adjust downwards to reflect the new requirements. Others say those costs are just passed on to everyone else. So the developer passed those costs on to the market purchasers in that condominium development. And this question of who bears the cost of inclusionary zoning requirements has been studied quite extensively, especially in the United States, where there are hundreds of jurisdictions who have implemented IZ. The leading studies from the San Francisco and Boston metropolitan areas have concluded that inclusionary zoning has little or no significant impact on housing production or market rate housing prices. The experience is that developers continue to build. So just as is the case now, developers can only increase housing prices up to what the market can bear. And this doesn't change when you layer on IZ requirements. So increased costs or reduced revenues as a result of lower rents can either impact land values or developer profit. And our analysis assumes that most costs are fixed. So developers aren't going to accept lower profit, otherwise they'll take their time and money to another development project. And otherwise, soft and hard costs for development are generally dictated by the market. And what can really change or shift is that land value. However, if land values shift too much and because affordable housing requirements are set too high, there is a risk that developers may choose to stop building in that area, or that landowners will decide not to sell their land for residential redevelopment. And so our consultants looked at 11 test sites across the city representing a range of market conditions. For each of those test sites, we looked at the existing land value for a development with no affordable housing requirement, and the land value for a development with an IZ requirement. In order to be considered what we call viable, the residual land value for a development with IZ requirements had to be at least 10% greater than the existing land value. And so this goes back to ensuring that development continues to take place. So here's a quick snapshot of one of the test results from our analysis. This is looking at a condominium development being required to set aside 10% of the whole project as affordable housing. We can see that all 11 market areas tested continue to support viable developments. But it's important to note that the impacts to land values vary across the different geographies. Some areas like the downtown saw a 10 to 20% impact to land values. Other areas like Weston saw 30 to 50% impact to land value. And I guess when we talk about impact to land value, know that even a 10% impact can amount to millions or tens of millions of dollars. Here are the results again for a rental development, setting aside 10% of the total residential GFA as affordable housing. Here we can see that development viability is more challenged for rental development compared to condo developments. And so what we did was combine this residual land value analysis and the results with 5-year trends in housing market data to establish what we call a strong market check. And the purpose of this strong market check is really to identify areas of the city that have the capacity to absorb IZ requirements while continuing to support development viability. Strong market areas are shown in dark gray on the map and are generally areas of the city with who have experienced the greatest amount of new housing supply, significant price escalation and growth in rental prices, and areas where that residual land value analysis supported viable development. Moderate market areas are shown in pink hatching on the map and include Etobicoke Center and North York Center. And these are areas that didn't quite meet our strong market check, but where the planning frameworks provide for significant new development. So within these gray and pink areas on the map, IZ is proposed to be implemented only around 500 to 800 meters around those red dots being future protected major transit station areas. So outside of these areas, we're not proposing to implement inclusionary zoning at this time. However, we're proposing to update and review this analysis after 3 years, so more areas of the city could be captured by IZ requirements over time. So over the next few slides, I'll give a very quick overview of what we propose to date for the draft inclusionary zoning policy. The geographic application I just spoke to, so I'll talk about the scale of development. IZ, we propose, would apply to developments proposing either 100 or 140 new units in a development. And so the intent behind this is really to exempt most mid-rise developments from inclusionary zoning requirements. While we think all forms of housing should include affordable housing, we know that mid-rise developments are more challenged and require a different planning framework. Next, we propose that affordable housing units created through inclusionary zoning would have to stay affordable for 99 years. And this is one of the key changes that came out of consultations. We had initially consulted on a 25-year affordability period, but heard from very strongly from stakeholders in the public that that really wasn't long enough to secure a sustainable supply of affordable units. In terms of the number or percent of affordable housing required in a development, we propose different requirements depending on whether a condo or purpose-built rental development is proposed and whether that development's located in one of our strong or moderate market areas. So a condo development would be required to set aside 10% of the total residential gross floor areas of affordable housing if it's located in a strong market area. It would be 5% for a moderate market area, and then 3 to 5% for a rental development. And as part of our consultations on inclusionary zoning over the fall and into the winter, I think we heard quite strongly about the expectation that these percentages should be higher, and we consulted on policy options to increase those percentages. Next up, we proposed that incentives, so financial or regulatory incentives from the city, would only be considered where a development is proposing to provide more affordable units or deeper levels of affordability. And then in terms of transition, we heard that a clear transition period is needed to allow for those land values to adjust. And so we proposed that inclusionary zoning would not apply to development applications submitted before January 1st, 2022. After that date, IZ would only be implemented in areas where a protected major transit station area had been approved by the minister. And then related to our work on inclusionary zoning, the city is also consulting on new definitions of affordable housing that would incorporate an income-based approach. For those who don't know, our existing definition is based on average market rents by bedroom type as reported annually by CMHC. But through our consultations on our housing action plan and inclusionary zoning, we heard concerns that average market rents are increasingly out of step with household incomes and what people can actually afford for housing. And so our proposed new definitions would be based on the least expensive of average market rent or what a set income percentile could afford paying no more than 30% of their income towards shelter costs, including utilities. So these new affordable rents would be published on an annual basis. And we propose that affordable housing created through inclusionary zoning would be based off of these new affordable rents and prices. As you can see here, affordable rent prices or rents are shown in green, and they would be addressing that middle level of affordability. So they won't provide that same depth of affordability as rent geared to income housing, but will be lower than asking rents for purpose-built rental units and condo rents. And I'll note that these numbers are based on 2020 data. But based on this chart, we can see that inclusionary zoning and our affordable rents would target key workers in our city. For example, a grocery store salesperson would be able to afford a bachelor unit, dental assistant, a one-bedroom unit, dental assistant for a two-bedroom unit, early childhood educator would be able to afford a one-bedroom unit, and registered nurses, three-bedroom units. And finally, in terms of next steps, so our consultants are currently updating that assessment report analysis to factor in some post-COVID housing market data and those proposed affordable definitions. And this analysis, as well as what we've heard through consultation over those 2 rounds of consultation, will help inform our final recommended policy, which will go to City Council in the coming months. So that's it. Very quick snapshot of our work to date on IZ, but looking forward to the discussion and questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Christine. Really informative, really clear as well. So very helpful, and it's a great start to our panel. We have time for maybe a question. If there's a question out there, I see there's a Q&A button here. I'm a little bit of a dinosaur when it comes to all this new technology. So there's a question about what major transit area might entail, subway station, bus route, etc. There's a question about who determines what percentage of a building is given over to IZ. Does a developer have any say in that? And a question here, would the city consider or consider supporting making the IZ permanent? So I think those are the 3 questions that pop up in here. So yeah, so if
I can give quick answers to all 3. So first, the transit stations include major transit stations. So that's subways, LRT, GO train stations. The second question about the set percentage. So it's the city who will establish in our policy what percentage of the building has to be set aside as affordable housing. So that will be set up front in our policy and not negotiated site by site. And then the third question, I've just forgotten.
Oh, it's about the 99 years versus making the affordability permanent or some other time frame.
Yeah, so we propose a 99-year affordability period for the units. Um, we've looked into requiring it permanently or in perpetuity. There's just some legal workarounds that we can't require it in perpetuity. We actually have to set an end date for the affordable units. Otherwise, the Land Titles Act allows people to go and make a request to the land register to remove it after 40 years.
Okay. And there's one more question that I'll ask. There's another question after that, but we can maybe get back to that after. But there's a question. I understand this is a provincial requirement and not a design decision made by the city. But if you make IZ requirements only within the PMTSAs, the transit areas, does that not incentivize development to go outside of those areas? So yeah, that would be an interesting question.
Yeah, and maybe we can get into it later. I think if we look back at our development pipeline over the past 5 years, the majority, or about 75% of new residential units, were located within areas around transit stations and within our proposed strong and moderate market areas. So, you know, it will capture the majority of new development taking place, but it's a good point, and really the city has been looking to be able to implement inclusionary zoning outside of PMPSAs because we think there are other areas of the city where it should be implemented.
Okay, so thanks so much, Christine. That was really great. So usually we would clap, you know, so clap, clap, clap. So let's move on now to our next panelist. Jeremy Withers is a PhD candidate in the University of Toronto, and his dissertation is focusing on the development and potential of inclusionary zoning in Toronto. And I'll just remind everyone that the time available for the presentation is sort of 10 to 15-minute range. So you can take the floor, Jeremy, wherever you are. Just so you know, Jeremy, we can't hear you yet, so you might want to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Okay, let me just get this screen share going. My PowerPoint shared. Good. Okay. My name is Jeremy Withers. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning here at U of T. I also work with the Affordable Housing Challenge project and help to organize the event tonight. So it's really exciting to see 120 odd people here. So in tonight's talk, I'm going to begin by walking us through some alarming statistics which highlight how increasingly disconnected the price of new housing has become from the needs of most residents. And then I'm going to discuss the city planning's current draft IZ policy, which Christine has presented on. And I'm going to argue that it falls far short of the true potential of IZ to expand access to affordable housing, as seen through the IZ feasibility studies that the city commissioned. So in neighborhoods all across Toronto, people are struggling to make ends meet because the price of housing is skyrocketing. The price of owning a house has become out of reach for a growing majority of renters, and rents have risen so high in the past few years that even after the decrease in listing prices we've seen during COVID, hundreds of thousands of Torontonians live in fear that they're only an eviction away from displacement or homelessness. And today, with over 1 in 10 Toronto renters in arrears, it's no exaggeration to call this an emergency, but it's one long in the making. When it comes to providing the needs of low and middle income residents, the city planning process is quite broken. In recent years, new housing built in the city has been unaffordable to the vast majority of residents. Today, almost half of Toronto's households are renters, and they're on track to outnumber owners, with the number of renter households growing more than 3 times faster than the number of owner households over the last decade. But despite this declining home ownership rate, over the past decade, 9 condo units were built for every 1 purpose-built rental unit. And of that tiny number of purpose-built rental units, just over 1 in 4 were priced at less than average market rent, which is the city's current definition of affordable. To put that in perspective, Of all the housing units built in Toronto over the last decade, only 2.5% were priced affordably for the poorer half of renters. And that's just over 4,000 units completed for just over 250,000 lower income renter households. So with growing need and shrinking supply of affordable rental housing, it's no wonder average rents have increased more than twice as fast as average income for renters over the past 5 years, pushing many households into crisis. So if most housing units built in Toronto are condos, who is actually able to afford them? In 2020, the City of Toronto prepared a housing needs analysis as part of their IZ planning process. And in it, they calculate which segments of Toronto's population would find buying a condo affordable. The study considers condos unaffordable if households need to spend more than 30% of their income on annual housing payments. And you can see in the box on the top right, they find that households would need to make over $106,000 per year to afford payments on average newly built one-bedroom condo. And households would need to make over $160,000 per year to afford payments on an average newly built two-bedroom condo. So what percentage of residents are able to afford these rates? For households in Toronto that already own a home, less than 40% would find buying an average new one-bedroom condo affordable. And less than 20% would find buying a two-bedroom affordable. But I think a much more pressing question is, what percentage of Toronto's renters, i.e. households who already own homes, can afford these prices? And the answer should really sit with us. Today, over 90% of renter households in Toronto would find payments unaffordable for a new bachelor condo, or for that matter, a resale bachelor condo. Now, an important caveat to these numbers is that unfortunately many households do spend more than 30% of their income on housing payments. So let's ask what percentage of renter households in Toronto would be able to afford payments of that average price new bedroom, one bedroom condo if they put 45% of their income towards housing payments. And the answer is about 20%. So 4 out of 5 renters can't afford a new average priced one bedroom condo, even if they put 45% of their income towards payments. If these new units being produced aren't affordable to most renters, who's buying them? And I think the answer is pretty obvious, and that's investors, increasingly. According to CMHC's 2020 rental market survey published this January, on average across the GTA over the last 5 years, 50% of newly completed condo units were immediately rented out as investment properties. In 2020, that number jumped to 57%. And the total percent of new condos bought as investment properties in recent years is likely significantly higher, especially in the City of Toronto, as these calculations don't include units being held vacant or units being rented out on short-term rental platforms like Airbnb. So these numbers tell a story of a city in which housing is by and large being developed solely for the purpose of expanding the speculative profits of developers, landowners, and investment property speculators. The needs of most residents are being left unserved. And the sad truth is that the city doesn't have much power to change this. Even when residents come out to consultations en masse to argue the city shouldn't approve a development unless some of its units are priced more affordably, the city has little power to reject buildings on this basis. Should they do so, the decision would almost certainly be appealed by the developer to the Provincial Appeals Tribunal, the LPAT, which almost certainly would rule in the developer's favor. City planning has for far too long lacked the power to plan for a more affordable city. They lack the power to ensure that the price of the units they're considering approving bears some relation to the needs of the communities living there. And that's why it's so exciting that Toronto is finally close to the finish line with implementing IZ. After many years of advocacy, almost 3 years ago to the day, the province of Ontario finally permitted municipalities to create their own IZ requirements. And Toronto has been in the process of preparing and consulting on IZ for about 2 years and is now months away from voting on into action. So let's turn to the question of how much affordable housing could be required in Toronto through IZ and how that compares to what the city is proposing. So Toronto's late to the game in implementing IZ. Hundreds of jurisdictions across the US, Europe, and Canada have used it for many years, in some cases many decades. Cities like New York require many developments set aside 25%, sometimes 30% of their floor area for affordable rental units. In London, England, many proposals for high rises are now required to set aside up to 50% of new floor area for affordable housing. So that's why housing advocates across the city have been so frustrated to see how conservative the city's current draft policy is. In September 2020, City Planning published a draft IZ policy, which we just heard Christine present on. The current draft policy would require 5 to 10% of new condo units. Well, you can see this this here. It's 5 to 10% of new condo developments are set aside for affordable housing if they're over 100 to 140 units. 3 to 5% of new rental developments if they're over 100 to 140 units. And it's important to understand, as Christine was saying, IZ would only apply in certain areas, which are within 800 meters of subways or GO train stations. About a year and a half ago, as part of Bill 108, Doug Ford restricted the areas IZ could apply to such areas. And now, thankfully, these areas are currently where a great deal of the city's housing development is taking place. Perhaps even the majority, though I'll leave it to Christine to confirm that. Nonetheless, these changes come as a huge blow to affordable housing advocates who want the city to get the most out of this policy, and to the city itself, which continues to advocate for the province to allow IZ to be required citywide. With this heavy-handed provincial interference in mind, it seems all the more important that Toronto implements a policy that creates as much affordable housing as possible in these areas. So how much affordable housing is it possible to require? Well, as Christine mentioned, the city commissioned an IZ feasibility study to answer this question. The city study was conducted in May 2019, updated in May 2020, and will be updated again next month. The study assesses in 11 different areas of the city what percentage of the floor area of a typical condo development and a typical rental development could feasibly be required to be set aside as affordable. Essentially, if developers are still able to make at least a 15% profit margin and landowners are able to receive at least 10% above the current value of the land, the development is deemed feasible. And we're lucky to have Steve Pomeroy here speaking next, whose talk will go into the depth, explaining the methodology behind these studies. But what they find is fascinating, what these studies find. The city study shows that it would be feasible to require 2 to 4 times more affordable units than the current draft policy would require, depending on the area. This means that right now, developers and landowners are making such large returns that developments could be made to heavily discount many units and still make that 15% profit margin. For example, the study demonstrates that in every single area studied, typical condo developments could be required to set aside at least 10% of their floor area. In 3/4 of the area studied, typical condo developments could be required to set aside at least 20% for affordable rental units. And I'm sure we're all asking the same question now, which is what's the maximum percentage of affordable units the city could require in each area? And it's frustrating to find that the city study doesn't actually ask. That is, it only asks whether up to 20% is feasible in each area. So fortunately, another feasibility study was commissioned by the Maytree Foundation and authored by Steve Pomeroy in the summer of 2019. And it uses the same methodology and very similar assumptions to the city study, and finds, for example, that up to 39% of typical condo developments could be feasibly set aside as affordable in high price areas like downtown and Young Eglinton. So that's a lot. So clearly by neglecting to ask what's possible beyond 20%, the city study is unable to tell us anywhere near the full potential of IZ is. So far, we've only talked about IZ for condo developments, but the feasibility study also found that typical rental developments could support a lot more affordability. So these studies demonstrate that a much bolder approach could be required of most new developments across the city without slowing down the supply of housing. It seems clear that the current draft policy is far too low and places the desire of investors and landowners to continue making large windfalls in front of the rights of Torontonians to affordable housing. That's why ACORN, Progress Toronto, the Parkdale People's Economy, and other housing advocates from across the city are now organizing a citywide campaign for a bolder approach to implementing IZ. These organizations are united in advocating for a policy that would require a minimum of 20 to 30% of new high-rise residential developments are set aside for rental housing permanently affordable for a mix of low and middle income residents. Having looked at precedents from other major cities and the city's own feasibility studies, we can see this would by and large be feasible to require of most condo developments and of a significant number of rental developments. There are, of course, a few outlying areas in the city which may need to begin with lower requirements and have these higher requirements phased in more gradually. But it's no coincidence that the areas of the city where the vast majority of housing is currently taking place are those where the highest requirements are feasible. So why are the city's draft recommendations so much lower than what is demonstrably feasible for typical developments? I've had the pleasure of speaking to city planning and to the authors of the city's feasibility studies a number of times about these issues. including Christine Ono, who's helped me understand that the potential challenges that would arise from requiring the maximum feasible affordable rates can be broken down into two main concerns. The first is that while it's true that the feasible rate calculated for each area is based on what a typical development with average costs would be facing, there are inevitably sites in each area for which projects would likely face above average costs. For example, there may be a site that has a heritage designation or extensive soil contamination that leads to significantly more expensive costs than typical sites. So a question we need to pose of the city is, do we need to let these outliers set the affordability rate for all the projects in an area? And by looking at how most cities deal with this issue, the answer seems to be certainly not. Most cities with IZ will provide an opportunity for individual projects to appeal the area's IZ requirements. For a developer to receive a lower requirement, they have to be able to demonstrate extraneous circumstances to an appointed committee. So in New York City, for example, developers can appeal to a committee for an affordability rate that is lower than 25% or 35% rate that's normally required in certain areas. In fact, when discussing this with Christine last week, she mentioned that city staff have spoken with New York City's housing commissioner about this process and heard that no developer has yet been successful in convincing that committee their development would be made unviable by New York City's 25 or 30% requirement. It seems clear that if Toronto were to take a similar approach and provide developers the option of appealing IZ requirements, the city could ensure that projects with unique constraints would remain viable. The second concern that's often raised when considering whether to require 20 to 30% affordability rate is the fear that doing so would shock the market. Developers or landowners might go on strike. And the concern is that if a developer were to have bought land in the past few years, but had yet to have their project proposal approved, they could be placed in a financially precarious situation if they were suddenly required to include such a large amount of affordable units. Having paid for the land or the impression they'd be able to make a certain amount of revenue selling all the units at market rates, they may find their project no longer pencils out and their projected revenue is now lower than costs. So this is a real concern, but luckily it's a brief one, easily resolved by ensuring a transition period through which IZ requirements are phased in over the course of a few years. But unless the city clearly indicates to the market the full IZ requirements toward which they want to transition, they cannot expect the market to begin adapting to that new reality. So in conclusion, let's take a big picture perspective on the potential of IZ in Toronto. Right now, there are a staggering 194,000 new housing units that have been proposed and are under review by the city's planning department. As we've seen, the majority of these are high-rise condos. If 20% of these proposed units were required to be affordable rental, Toronto would create an additional 39,000 permanently affordable rental units in the coming year. And this would effectively double the city's current commitment to support the creation of 40,000 affordable rental units by 2030. Let's look at the potential from another perspective. Between 2010 and 2019, 159,000 units of housing were completed in Toronto, most of them in high-rise condos. If 20% had been required to be affordable, Toronto could have added 31,800 new affordable units over the past decade. Had it done so, the city would have succeeded in more than tripling its goal of 10,000 new affordable units, which was laid out in Housing Opportunities Toronto 2010 to 2020 plan. But more to the point, it would have succeeded in completing almost 8 times more than the just over 4,000 units that it actually completed during that period of affordable rental. So importantly, these units created through IZ needn't cost the city a dime. With IZ, it is developers and the owners of land they bid to build on that ultimately pay for the affordable units by reducing their profit margins. This is in stark contrast to those 4,093 affordable units, which were predominantly created by providing developers with free public land and financial incentives. And it's also in contrast to the 40,000 affordable units the city's new 10-year housing plan has committed to creating by providing developers with $13 billion in incentives, 2/3 of which the city is hoping upper orders of government will provide. So in conclusion, if the city is to live up to its recent commitment to work towards the realization of the right to adequate and affordable housing for every resident, it seems that it needs to open its eyes to the full potential of IZ and to write and legislate a policy that fulfills this potential. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeremy. So really informative. It seems like it'll fit, it'll seeg into Steve's presentation very well. There's only really one room for one question right now. So we'll ask one question and then we'll move on to Steve's presentation, but there's a whole host of questions in the Q&A box that I'll read after all the presentations are over, and we can have a discussion of some of those points as well. But the question I think that you might want to answer is that, can IZ be useful to apply to other types of uses other than residential? So, it says, we know there's a critical lack of affordable retail and commercial and industrial spaces as well. Do you think that inclusionary zoning would be a helpful policy for those things, or is it only for, say, providing affordable housing?
That's a very good question, and it's interesting to think that it's one I haven't heard very often. I think that quite simply the answer would be if there is significant revenue that comes from those projects over and above the actual costs of producing them, and that revenue is over and above a kind of modest profit margin that would be enough to motivate the landowner and developer to proceed with it, then exactly as you would say with inclusionary zoning for residential development, that would be the case. I think that we'd have to be hesitant to give a hard yes on that, considering how precarious the commercial real estate market is in Toronto right now. But I think it's a very good question and should be pursued by city planning.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeremy. So this actually segues very well, I think, into Steve's presentation. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Steve Pomeroy. Steve Pomeroy has over 35 years of experience in policy research, strategic analysis, program implementation, and market research related to housing issues. The substantive focus of much of his work has been on affordable housing and urban development. He's worked in the municipal level as an urban planner, in the nonprofit sector as a cooperative housing in cooperative housing development, and also held a variety of senior positions with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation in the 1984 to 1994 timeframe. Since 1994, he's completed over 200 reports. I've read many of them, and they're really excellent, and studies with his firm Focus Consulting. In 2012, he also joined Carleton University Center for Urban Research and Education, where he's now a senior research fellow, as well as an adjunct professor in the School of Public Policy at Carleton University in Ottawa, of course. And so with that, I'll hand the floor over to Steve.
Thanks, Alan, and hello, everybody. I'm talking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe nations here in the Ottawa Valley, and we're thankful to the past, current, and elders of those First Nations for sharing their land with us. To some extent, Jeremy has sort of set me up to talk about the feasibility study that I did, which I wasn't actually planning to do. I will come back to it a little bit, but because it's such a technical analysis, I thought we'd get bogged down in 10 minutes. And so I thought it was more useful to talk a little bit about the economics of inclusionary zoning and how the planning process actually has a very important role in creating the value that can enable the city to push well beyond the very meek levels of inclusion that Jeremy has already critiqued. So I think there's considerable potential there. And by way of context, I mean, I think Christine's really already gone over this in terms of provincial legislation, what inclusionary zoning is. The key point is that if we're coming along after the fact, where a developer is already planning a development with a certain number of units and asking them to give up some of the revenues that they would generate from selling those units or renting those units, there is an extraction, there is a tax on that developer, and we need to think about how to manage that piece and in some way compensate the developer for that particular cost. But there's in terms of that approach, there are a couple of ways we can think about doing that. If we think about a developer, if he has a unit, which seems pretty low in Toronto these days, but can sell it for $500,000, requiring him to provide that unit at an affordable rent, say 80% of the average market rent, which would be about $1,000 a month in Toronto, would essentially, without getting into the technical details, the capitalized value of that rental revenue would make the unit worth about $200,000 to that developer. So we have to figure out how to compensate him for the loss of $300,000 in order to accept and not really push very hard against the politicians not to include inclusionary zoning. And I think we do need the development industry to be on side in terms of developing this policy and implementing it. So one option would be, as Christine talked about, to provide various incentives and offsets, waiving fees and charges using the open door mechanisms that you have in Toronto. But I think the more potentially beneficial way in that we don't have to have a big tax expenditure on the part of the city, and nor do we have to have to bleed the developer dry in terms of their profit, is to utilize the planning process to actually create new value and share that new value equally between the community in the form of community housing or affordable housing and with the developer. And what we do see in most, pretty well all of the redevelopments that are happening, certainly those in the transit areas, in almost all cases, we are talking about a rezoning process where there's a substantial increase in the density from what's currently allowed in the zoning bylaw and the official plan. So I think the theory of this is really that land has no inherent value. A bare piece of land, until the municipal council says you can do this with that piece of land, if it's basically parkland, it has some passive use, really doesn't have much commercial value. But it's the planning process and subsequently the council's approval of a use which is what actually causes the value in that land. And therefore, it's the planning process as opposed to the greedy developers that are the ones that actually cause land values to go up. By sending signals to the market. They say, we're going to allow an increase in density around all these transit sites. The developer says, well, if I buy that site, I can go from 1 unit to 100 units. I can significantly increase my revenues and my profits. So I'm going to go pay more for that land. So the planning process is actually highly culpable in driving up land values and land costs, and hence driving up house prices and negatively affecting affordability. So I think the planning process, the planning profession has to take a pretty serious look in the mirror around how it actually functions and how it actually creates value and how it utilizes value. So to use a very simple example, if we have a site where you can currently zone for one house, the house could sell for $500,000, it costs $350,000 to build it, including a developer profit. A rational investor who is going to buy that piece of land to build the house wouldn't pay more than $150,000 for the land, the difference between the maximum they can generate in proceeds and the cost. They'd ideally try and bid a little bit lower than that, especially if they thought there was some risk, but if it's already zoned for one dwelling, there's no risk. So essentially the vendor of the land would charge them $150,000 or ask $150,000. If that particular site, the city decides it's near a transit station, it's going to rezone it to 10 units. Obviously, this is not realistic in terms of the densities you can get, but the math works better with 10. I can do it in my head. So let's assume we have the same selling price. We now have a $5 million potential revenue coming from this particular development. If we have the same thing, 10 times the $350,000 of construction cost, including profit, we've got a $3.5 million cost. And then by the same mathematics, the land value is essentially $1.5 million. The owner of that land, seeing that the city has designated that particular site for a density of up to 10 units, says, oh, well, developers are going to be willing to pay me up to 1.5. That's what I'm going to put it on the market for. So the city, by simply designating and changing the density or proposing, not even actually doing it, just in the official plan, suggesting that they will entertain applications to increase the density from 1 to 10 units, have essentially just raised the value of that land tenfold from $150,000 to $1.5 million. So the decision to actually allow a higher density is sending a signal to the market, and the market then takes that signal and it's then captured in the price of the land. And so in this particular instance, the current owner of that site has a windfall gain of $1.35 million. You basically just won the lottery when the city decided to raise the density on his site. And in the case where the landowner is the person who's actually going to develop it, rather than a developer coming along and buying the land to develop, that windfall gain translates and flows into a very, very high amount of excess profit. And this is really where you do the financial analysis that Christine talked about of saying, is it viable? Is it possible to extract affordable units from these developments where developers are making such excess profits? That's where the potential is there. And the greater the excess profit, the higher the number of inclusionary units you could actually create. So in a so what we've seen here is it's the planning process, the official plan that says transit stations, we're going to intensify. Developers, go knock yourselves out fighting with each other to bid up the value of that land before you go ahead and build on it. That's kind of what happens right now. If the official plan, as it hopefully it will do as of January of next year, explicitly states that as a condition of getting that higher density, you also have to 20% of the units have to be available, made available at affordable rents, and we can you can have fewer units at very low rents or more units at moderate rents. There's various ways you can mix that up, but for the sake of argument, let's say that, as we said at the very outset, that the capitalized value of the rents that those affordable units would generates $200,000. It's sending a signal to the market. Now the developer knows that he's not going to generate $1.5 million in profit because he's going to have to give up $300,000 per unit. For if he does 2 units out of this 10, would be $400,000. So he's now going to lower the amount that he would bid for the site. The vendor of the site is similarly going to ask less for the site because he knows developers won't bid more than that. So by having an explicit policy that the market can see, we've just sent another signal to the market to say, no, hang on a minute, guys, don't go out there and bid that up to 1.5. Otherwise, you're going to take a hit. Be rational and don't bid more than 4.6 for the site. Sorry, more than 1.1 for the site in this particular case. So we can see in this example, a very simple example, how critically important the decisions that council makes and planning development committee make when they approve change in zoning and increase in density. They are conveying a massive windfall gain to the owner of the site, whether that's a current owner or that's going to sell to a developer, or whether it's the developer who was prescient and saw the plans for where the transit lines were going to go and 5 years ago bought sites around there. Those are the guys who are going to be making piles of money as a result of the policy to intensify around those transit stations. So essentially, an intensification policy, as existed in the official plan in the absence of inclusionary zoning policy, creates a massive windfall gain. But if we then accompany that official plan policy statement with another one that requires inclusion, we essentially grow the overall value, we grow the pie. Now we can basically say, okay, we just increased the value by $1.35 million in our earlier example. Let's let the developer have a few more market units. Let's let the developer make a bit more money, but at the same time, he can afford also to contribute some of that excess profit back to supporting affordable units. And then you get into doing the math of what's a fair share, how many affordable units do we get, and how do we do that in a way that you don't have a negative effect on the developer. And also we don't have to dip into the city's contributions, which is a cost to the city, it's a cost to the taxpayer, to waive development charges, to waive permit fees, to reduce taxes, whatever the particular incentive might happen to be. So that's the theoretical kind of basis of what I talk about in the Maytree report. And this whole notion of what in England they call planning gain, simply because it's the planning process that created the uplift and created the gain. So I used that particular theory and value to estimate the values across a number of sites. But instead of using 11 model sites the way that the MBLC did, I took a prototypical development of 100 units and I placed it in different areas and adjusted the cost, because in lower value areas, the land values are lower. In some cases, the parking requirements are higher because it's not near transit. I'm not going to get into all the technical details, but it was quite precise in using a whole bunch of different cost estimates. And then it determined what's the cost of the developer to build. How much can he generate in terms of the prices that currently exist at current market prices? And to what extent would he be able to absorb the cost of creating a certain number of units at 60% of the average market rent or 100%? So when I did the study, we were looking at 2018 market rents where average market rent was about $1,380. 60% would be $825. So not super, super low, as Christine indicated. We're trying to find that sort of, lower middle market as opposed to truly deep affordability. But you can certainly stack a rent supplement or stack a housing allowance to get to affordability if you can create the product at that modest price. What we saw is that the costs changed a little bit between the zones, but the prices changed massively, which is why in your higher value zones, you can generate much more excess profit, especially if you bought the land 5 years ago, than you can in the low value zones. And there is tremendous potential to cover the significantly higher ratios of inclusion than those that the city's draft plan is currently proposing to allow. And I've got a chart just in a second that actually shows you that. But essentially, while 20% across the board, which is the way that NBRC looked at it in their analysis, it's true, it's not viable across all zones, but it is certainly quite feasible in mid-market and high-value zones, not necessarily in low zones. In cases even in the low zones, though, we could apply the open door policies in those areas to actually bump it up to a minimal kind of level. And then in terms of rezoning, obviously in the high value zones, we're going to higher densities. I won't get into that level of detail right now, but the bottom line is shown in this particular chart. So we can kind of see and there are two different approaches. One is the current zoning, where we don't actually even increase the zoning. Is there enough excess profit already being generated? Which is the first two columns on the left-hand side of the chart, one at 100% of average market rent, the other at 60% of average market rent. And then there's the rezoning one. So dealing with the current zoning, we can see that even in the low market zones, including some offsets from the city incentives, we could do a small number of units, 2 to 3% in those areas. But in the high value areas, we can get well over 20%, 24% with rents as low as 60% and even more if we go slightly higher rents. In the case of rezoning, we can exceed 40% in the high value areas, exceed 20% in the medium value areas, and get above 5% in the even in the low value areas. So there is significant potential to, as I say, to go significantly higher than what the city has indicated. I suspect because the province changed the initial legislation and restricted it only to transit-oriented areas, that the low value areas don't tend to be the ones next to the TOD areas. So that's really not really that relevant. It's really the mid-value and high-value ones that are more important. So there, I think we are looking in the range of 15 to 25% as a realistic and reasonable threshold that the city should be thinking about. So just by way of conclusion, the reports that I wrote, the recommendations that we had in there, is that obviously the rates would have to vary across value zones, which is what NBRC said as well. It can be implemented in areas where you're already zoned. Otherwise, I think in the case of transit areas, it's very rare that a site would already be zoned for a high density. It probably is going to go through a rezoning process. So again, those two left-hand columns in the chart are not really as relevant. The whole theory that I talked about, this depends on sending signals to the market, and it takes time to transmit those. So we need to basically let the market know, let the developers know that in some point in the future, this policy is going to be implemented. And if you're going out and buying land today, you need to be aware of it. And as I showed in the example, capitalize this cost into your estimates. And in doing so, I think you could probably, we want to implement it sooner than later, but you could phase it in slowly, and you could start off with 5% and go up 5, 10, 15, 20 over a 4-year kind of period, and a little bit lower when existing zoning is in place. But as I say, that's not really relevant, and then higher for the rezonings. And I mean, there is a legal technicality that Christine spoke about in terms of 99 years versus in perpetuity. But certainly in the UK, where this is ubiquitous, you can't get a development permit in the UK for a site bigger than 2 hectares without including 25% of the units as affordable housing. And the development industry has recognized this as the cost of doing business. They've developed strong partnerships with the non-profit housing sector. They do a deal with the local housing association. And they say, look, we're building building 100 units. We want to deed 25 of these units to you. You take them, you run with them, you keep them forever and keep them affordable. So I think we need to think about those kind of joint venture arrangements between the nonprofit sector and private developers as a way to actually figure out how to keep these things affordable in perpetuity. And by transferring title to the nonprofit, we get around the technical detail that Christine mentioned. Just to sort of wrap up, I think I understand that NBLC are currently updating their analysis for the city in terms of how have things changed since the earlier piece. And I think the key things here is we have seen during COVID, supply chain constraints. You go to the lumber yard, you can't find lumber, so there are material constraints which will have some increased cost effect. But I think that's largely going to be offset by a whole bunch of other factors. We've seen prices go up substantially, and just in the last COVID year, from January to January, house prices went up 28% in Toronto, and condo prices have gone up 11%, despite having initially dropped a little bit. Mortgage rates are substantially lower today than they were in 2019. Back then, with NBLC and myself both used 3.5%. And today, if you're a developer with good relationships with a lender, you can probably get below 2%, certainly 2.5%. So it's substantially less expensive in terms of interest costs, which has a beneficial effect. And in case of trying to figure out how much is the cost of providing the affordable rental units, because rents have gone up so dramatically, they went up by over 5.1% in 18-19 and 4.7% last year in Toronto. So up 10%. Of course, that's not really helping the affordability piece, but it does help the math in terms of the amount the developer has to give up. So that's a positive bump. So I think all those things together, I would surmise that NBLC, if they do their math correctly, should come back with a recommendation to the city that they could actually increase the inclusion rates that they provided in their earlier report. And the other feature that now exists in the marketplace is a very substantial federal initiative, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, which already requires developers that utilize this financing mechanism that 20% of the units in their projects have to be affordable. So while the economics don't work so well for rental generally, when they're utilizing the RCFI program, and they have to do 20% anyway, I think the city should consider that and not exempt rental developments, but actually try to work in concert with that particular federal policy to see how much they can squeeze on the rental developments. I've probably run over time, but there you are.
Okay, thanks so much, Steve. Very informative. So we have a huge number of questions, but I think what we'll do is I'll just ask one, because we kind of just in the interest of time. I'll ask one, and then we'll come back to some of these questions, because some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A actually kind of apply to the whole panel, and so shouldn't necessarily be asked of any one individual presentation. There is a question, though, that I think relates directly to your presentation, and that's around a maximum percentage, and you highlighted that in different zones you could actually have a different maximum, like you could actually support a higher maximum, say downtown. But then you also said that you could slowly implement the IZ, start at a lower rate and then increase it over time. But in your presentation you said that if you set, say, a maximum, then it would bring down land costs. And so I guess the question would be, and it comes out of the Q&A, but why not just start with the maximum? If you say, okay, we can support, say, 30% or whatever in this particular area, why not slap that on right away? Wouldn't that bring the land costs down, not only there, but across the city? And wouldn't that be in the general interest of not only keeping land costs in check in Toronto, but also keeping housing affordable over the short, medium, and longer term?
In theory, yes, that is correct. But I think if we look at kind of the process, we've got, there are a different range of developers. Some developers land bank years ahead; they buy sites and they've bought at a historic cost. Others, particularly if you're a non-profit developer, you're going out there and trying to find land this week to try and build next year. So because a number of developers would be seeking to acquire land in order to do their development, imposing that now. In that case, they would bid a lot less for the land, but it would significantly impact those that had been bought in the last year, for example. It may take too big a bite because they would have overpaid for the site. So and then you're going to get a lot of political pushback from the development industry. And I think that the city's trying to find that balance between achieving its affordability objectives, but not creating so much opposition that they don't get the policy implemented. One has to remember that councillors are elected and they're bankrolled in election campaigns by developers. And they are a strong constituency. So I think that without imposing politics on Christine, it is a sensitivity that councillors are aware of. So I think trying to find that right balance, and so giving them advance notice, implementing over time is probably a more politically feasible method, even though it doesn't get you there as quickly as you might like to.
Okay, thanks so much, Steve. So there's a whole bunch of other questions, which I think will hold until after Alejandra's presentation. So after all four panelists have spoken, and then we'll kind of open up the panel to all these questions, and I'll do my best to try and moderate them. So let's move on to Alejandra's presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Alejandra Ruiz-Vargas. Alejandra is an anti-poverty activist and national leadership representative of ACORN, and a chair of the East York chapter of ACORN Canada. And for those of you in the audience who don't yet know what ACORN is a very important organization that is currently active in Toronto and has been very important promoting tenants' rights and others' rights in the city. And so they've been doing really, really excellent work. And so I'll hand over the floor to you, Alejandra.
Thank you so much. Well, I have been enjoying so much this meeting today, and thank you for inviting us. And yes, as Alan was saying, well, really we are experts, but we are experts in suffering, because we have been suffering so much with these renovations, demolitions, evictions. And what Alan was saying is, well, we are an organization that fights for social change. We are about 140,000 members across Canada. We are in 20 neighborhoods and in 9 cities. And we have been only fighting for affordable housing as well, childcare, internet for all, fair banking, and EI reform and predatory lending. So this is who we are. We are mostly tenants. And you can move the next slide, please. Thank you. So what I'm going to do today is to bring us back a little bit in time. And beside all this inclusionary zoning, we had a history and how we started with this campaign in 2006. Cherry De Novo, that is a NDP, MPP, introduced a private members bill that for inclusionary zoning. And she actually has to do it 5 times, and it wasn't taken care seriously. In 2008, ACORN did a partnership with Wellesley Institute, who put a report with Richard Darla, titled Inclusionary Housing in Toronto. And of course, it was totally pro-inclusionary zoning in the city. So in 2009 to 2014, like I was telling, the bill was passed 5 times until 2014. Peter Milchen, a liberal MPP, introduces the private members bill for inclusionary zoning, and as well didn't pass. Can you put the other slide, please? Thank you. So then in 2015, ACORN in Ottawa went to see this gentleman, Bob Chiarelli, and we did it in Fool's Day, and because we told them that they need to stop to be so foolish, isn't it? And they need to pass inclusionary zoning. And then here in Toronto, we did it. We went to my call. Actually, this was my first time that I did an action in Toronto. So can we pass the other slide, please? So here in 2006, ACORN organized actions across province, the whole province, because we needed that the province listen to us, and what we needed that the municipalities had the powers to have the inclusionary zoning fitted based on their needs. So in December 2016, we see here, well, people probably recognize Sean Mahar, Mike Layton, and the representation from ACORN. And finally, in 2016, we got the inclusionary zoning powers. Well, released to municipalities, but it wasn't to municipalities, it was a federal level. Can we pass then the next slide? Thank you. And then in December 2017, the regulations from province came out, but came out very pro-developer. Unfortunately, this is what we have been seeing all the time. And then we did a big action in 2018 at the 77 Bay, you know, where the Ministry of Housing is, and so many, allies, sorry, that were with us, like Mike Layton, Paula Fletcher, people like Peter Towans, APTO, Federation of Metro Tenant Association, we were with us, and we were able to secure a meeting. And 3 meetings later, you want to pass the next slide, please. We won finally. The IC, the municipality, had now the powers to fit and to create a very good inclusionary zoning. So we were so happy. We were thinking was a glorious this day. But then those 4 were elected, and in 2019, he enacts the legislation and limit the inclusionary zoning. As everybody knows probably, or you didn't know, this is what is happening. You see many pictures. We were working extremely powerful and continually looking the province will hear us. And yeah, this is what happened. But unfortunately, those 4 came in the picture, like I was telling you. So then can we pass the next slide, please? In May 2019, we released an inclusionary zoning best practices that you can go and see the link. And if you want the link, we can pass it to you later so you can see what we found out and what we believe is the best practices for inclusionary zoning. And then the next slide, please. So we have been working in city consultations that were wrapped in November 2020. We were in the second round of public consultations, and now we are waiting for the final vote. So can we pass, please, the next? We are looking to ask for a minimum of 20 or 30% and 30% for inclusionary zoning. And we are asking that the inclusionary zoning will be applied for 60 units or more, and that the CSI should be permanent, and this should be deeply affordable and should be for rental housing as well. So the next slide, please. So how we can win this is very important. We need power and numbers. Next slide, please. We need still keeping pressure on the politicians. I really like what Steve say. Unfortunately, many are elected politicians. They are based and they have to, well, pay attention what the developers say, because many of them has been given money, specifically Mr. Dodford. This is very well known. So, and we need to utilize election time because it works. We have been seeing. And I think so. My last remarks that I want that it will be very clear for everybody is that our counselor, Ana Bailao, had said many times that we have to have some inclusionary zoning, or the way that the city say that is 5 to 10%, or we're not going to have inclusionary zoning. But we believe that tenants at this point, tenants and people in general in the city, we need to fight for a good inclusionary zoning, for what we need, for what really we are in the need. So this is why we are we see that inclusionary zoning is not the whole solution for the housing crisis, but really it's an opportunity that can generate affordable housing faster and cheaper for in comparison to other initiatives that the city is working on it. So for this reason, we need the people to speak with our elected representatives, and we need to see our elected representatives to go and look for what we need, what the city needs, not for because the profit, because we are speaking here about life. So we need to change that narrative. Or when we know, because we know what we need and we know what the people has said, but the politicians needs to change this narrative, or our elected officials needs to change this narrative and get us a champions and go and do what we need, not what the developers are asking. So what we need is life over profits. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. That was a really excellent and direct, message. And I'm gonna ask one question that's kind of been posed in different ways in the Q&A here. So I'll ask it of you and see what you think. But a number of people have posed in the Q&A a question about profits and why we might even have to rely on private development. And I think you answered this partially already, that there's lots of different ways of providing housing. This is one way of getting more affordable units faster. But how would you, unlike say the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party or whatever, how would you adopt the inclusionary zoning policy right now so that it would provide more units faster and not necessarily have to respect this need to provide the profits for the developers? So what would you or ACORN recommend?
Well, we recommend 20 to 30%. We have been seeing that it's working in other municipalities, and already Jeremy said it, Steve, Richard Darla, other people across the globe has been saying that we need to have, I know that they say that the law doesn't allow to have something forever, but we don't want to give this to our grandchildren. I don't know if you want to give this problem to our grandchildren. This is like a hot potato, isn't it? Generation, let's pass this problem to the other generation. So this is why we don't want that. And the other thing is we believe that buildings that had 60 units, they should be able to have IC, because the city say that they're not going to be touched, but we believe that they can be working in the IC, because if not, it will be very unfair for the other developers, isn't it? The other question that has been in the air, and I don't know, is a good moment to touch, but I think so Jeremy touched it at some point, and Steve touched it as well, is the density. Density will be a great tool for give it to developers, and it will be a win-win. So, and the city has no needs to put money really.
So build up, reduce the requirement to 60 units and up, make it 20 to 30%. And then I guess there's also the question of whether we should have a targeted policy that only requires or only allows inclusionary zoning near transit, or should it be a kind of a universally applied policy across the city? That's another question that I guess I'll start with that one. How about that for the panel? Alejandra, if you want to be the first one to speak on this one, but I'll put it out there for everybody in the panel. What do you think of the policy that the Conservative government has come up with that restricts inclusionary zoning just to the transit areas, or should it be extended to the entire city? And should there be different, like a variable set of criteria applied across the city, or should it be a universally applied single limit, say 30% or something?
Well, as a tenant and as an ACORN member, and based on what we have been speaking and asking to our members and people in general, I think so people will feel second-class citizen if we not apply IC to all the city. So it will be like your better neighborhood. It will separate us more. The missed income will be like less. It will be a problem to find more missed income, and I think so. This is a huge problem that it will create a lot of ghetto. If you want to call it like that.
Okay, so we should be universally applied across the city is basically.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to ask that question to everybody on the panel. Maybe we could go Christine and then Steve and then Jeremy. Feel free to go in that order and answer that question on how that policy should be applied across the city.
So I guess I spoke a little about Toronto has been advocating for inclusionary zoning to be applied outside of PMTSAs. We're really focused on advancing a policy within the existing framework because we want to see inclusionary zoning in place as soon as possible. And then I guess just to take a step back, inclusionary zoning is really a policy that relies on market developments to deliver affordable housing. So if no market developments are taking place in an area, we're not going to get any new housing or any new affordable housing. And so where we've established those strong and moderate market areas, as I've mentioned, that's really where the majority of the development activity is taking place in the city. And that also happens to be generally the areas of the city with the highest proportion of renter households spending more than 50% of income towards rent. So those are the areas where the need for affordable housing is also there. And maybe I'll just speak quickly to Alejandra's point about applying IZ to smaller developments. We did look at what proportion of developments less than 140 units being proposed in the city over the past 5 years were, and really they only accounted for about 7% of the total residential units proposed in the pipeline. And so with those exemptions for smaller mid-rise developments, we're really only talking about exempting a really small proportion of new residential units being created in the city.
Okay, thanks so much, Christine. Steve, do you want to weigh in on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think in principle, I would agree with Alejandra. You want to apply it everywhere. Obviously, it's not the city's choice. The province has passed legislation that restricts what the city can do. But I think it's an important beachhead. I mean, getting the policy in place, starting to show that it can work with the plans to potentially extend out to other areas is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly as Christine says, if most of the development is happening in the TOD areas anyway, you are picking up most of it. But I say in principle, you would like to try and get to a lot, because one of the, in addition to creating affordable housing, we're also trying to create inclusive communities, and if it's inclusive everywhere, we create opportunities for people to live everywhere, not just in the low income area or the low value areas.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Jeremy, go ahead and weigh in.
Yeah, a little history to this. When the Wynne administration put forward their first draft IZ policy about 3 years ago, it was very prescriptive, and it was prescriptive in quite a few ways, including the areas that IZ could be in and the maximum rate it could be. And there was a really large swell of advocacy that I know Alejandra was involved in, I was involved in through Parkdale People's Economy. And organizations from all around the province signed a message saying this is not how you make an IZ policy work to its fullest. You give municipalities the power to assess which areas it would be feasible to require this policy, and you make sure that every area that it is feasible, they have the opportunity to help communities in those areas find more affordable housing. So I know that so to conclude that when the final IZ policy from the province was released by the Wynne administration 3 years ago, those voices were heard loud and clear, and it was an IZ policy that municipalities had a lot of power to set exactly how they wanted. So it was devastating loss, also to the city of Toronto, who advocated on this when Bill 108 came in and circumscribed the areas. And the fight continues, and I hope if we have a new provincial administration, we will see a change to that policy so that it is citywide as possible.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm looking at the time. It's 8:33. Sean, what was our schedule for the event again?
8:30.
8:30. Okay. So I think that then we're actually out of time. And but what we'll do is we'll make sure that we can resume our discussions on this, because obviously there's lots of questions. We only got to like a very small fragment of the discussions or the questions in the Q&A. And I've seen there's tons of information posted in the chat here. So this seems to be a very topical subject. And I do think that we're just on the verge of getting into some of the really interesting kind of policy questions. And so, but we did say 8:30. And so I think what we should do is we should formally kind of wrap up. I want to thank our panelists. So again, clap. I didn't do the clap after every one, but I should have done the clap after every single presentation. So thank you so much for giving your time and your presentation today, and for your expertise. And I do want to say, you know, there's a bit of a discussion here in the chat about some of the presentation or some of the comments kind of hammering on the city. And I do want to say that we're very cognizant of the fact that the city is actually doing their best in the circumstances, and the city is definitely a progressive partner on this subject. And so really, really happy to have the city along for that. And I do think that while there's some critique that's been mentioned here, we want to keep our communications up with the city. And as this policy continues being debated, as potential changes occur, and potentially if the Ontario electorate brings in a new party that wants to change the fundamental provincial policy, then that'd be great, and we can continue these discussions on how to make the inclusionary zoning policies better and more progressive. Okay, so thank you so much for your attendance and for participating. We really, really appreciate it.